I'm Josh Harris, and you're listening to Clear and Loud, a podcast about the ideas, stories, and voices that are shaping our world. Hey, we're back with another episode of the Clear and Loud podcast. Those of you who consistently listen know that this podcast is a way for me to interact with, engage with people who are putting messages and ideas out into the world. I think it's so interesting the different ways to do that. They're all different kinds of mediums, they're different types of platforms, people have different styles. I think that one of the most powerful and underrated forms of communication is the graphic novel. I think comics are so powerful in the way that they can communicate and convey ideas with the written word often, although some just have pictures, but the power of marrying that with illustration and storytelling in that form, man, it can just um, hit those emotions and convey feeling and meaning in ways that I think are really, really unique. So I'm talking with a comic book artist today. I'm talking with someone who is working on a graphic novel, and the unique intersection here with this conversation, it touches on two um, parts of my life that are quite interesting and that all kind of go back to my growing up years. But I when I was growing up, I loved comic books. My uncle had this huge stash of comics that I would, when I was over at my grandparents' house, I would go and I would read. So, like a lot of kids, I just loved consuming those. And then I wanted to be a cartoonist when I was growing up, so I made my own comic books and, just dumb little superhero style comics, but I just thought that was so powerful. And then when I was a teenager, I actually got very serious about comic book collecting, unbeknownst to my parents. So I was collecting these comics. They knew I was buying comics, but they didn't understand how much I was spending on them. So I was this homeschool kid. My dad was this homeschool teacher, leader, influential religious figure in different ways. And what he didn't know is that his son was spending thousands of dollars, like whatever money I could get my hands on in the little home businesses that I was running. Again, inspired by my dad, who taught me how to be an entrepreneur. I was putting all of that money not into the company, but back into my comic book collection. So I was buying all these comics, and at one point, my dad realized this. He realized the scope of this, and he sat me down and said, "You need to stop buying comics, cold turkey, no more." It was this very, like, he didn't always parent me like this, but it was very confrontive and very, like, serious and, one of those moments. I think he feels bad about the way this was handled, but he was definitely it was a power move of, as your parent, you cannot buy any more comics. So I locked up all my comics, and I was not allowed to buy any more. But there was a particular series of comics that I was so into the storyline. It was Akira. It's like the classic, Japanese comic Akira, and I could not resist buying the next issue. Not as a collector, but just as someone who was so engrossed with his story. And so I bought Akira, and then I hid it in our garage, and somehow my mother found this comic book. She never found the porn magazines, but she found the freaking comic book and gave this to my dad, and my dad brought me into his office and, you know, says, "What is this?" and lays this out in front of me. And I actually did feel really bad because I knew I'd really disobeyed. And so I said, "Dad, I'm so sorry." Um, and stupidly said, I will accept whatever punishment you feel that you need to give me." And without skipping a beat, my dad says, "I want you to throw away all of your comic books." And I had so many comic books, and I had invested so much in these, and some of them were actually quite valuable. I don't even wanna think about how valuable they are now. But I had to throw all of my comic books into the dumpster in our little apartment complex next to our duplex, and, that was the painful end of my association with comics. I've never really collected again because I think it just draws to mind too much pain. So, a little bit of pain related to comics, but a lifelong love for them. The other aspect of the connection to this conversation with Stephanie is that Stephanie is writing and drawing this graphic novel called Pure. It's a comic about purity culture. So comics and purity culture is the overlap here. And those of you who know my background, um, I was just completely immersed in the teachings and the ideas in the evangelical church in the 80s and 90s that are now looked back on and called purity culture. And purity culture, as we'll discuss in this conversation, is really just a very strict view of sexuality, sex being saved for marriage, a lot of guilt and control and shame around your body and anything that is drawing you towards lust or to think about sex or to engage in any type of sexual activity before marriage. And so I didn't just take that in, but I became an advocate of that as a young guy. I wrote a book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye, which became um, a very popular and widespread book that furthered purity culture, furthered the ideas of purity culture, advanced purity culture, maybe even spread it into it, from us the subculture of homeschooling into the evangelical church even further. So a lot of what Stephanie is doing in her book, Pure, is seeking to dismantle things that I built up in my writing and my teaching, and now a lot of the ideas that I've disavowed and apologized for. Um, And I just think that Stephanie is doing it in such an incredibly creative and interesting way. Um, I think she's one of the sharpest thinkers and communicators when it comes to this topic that I'm aware of, and I think she's approaching it in such a healthy way. So her book Pure, which is yet to be released, she's released much of it online, and she has a Patreon where you can get glimpses of it, and it's really incredible what she's doing, but she is retelling her own story. She's telling her experience of being in purity culture, the guilt that was put upon her, the way that that weighed on her relationship with her boyfriend, her now husband, um, and she's really just creating this incredible community of followers on social media and people who are reading this, who are experiencing so much um, healing as they process through the story that she's telling. And the amazing thing is that I don't think it would have anywhere near the power if she were just using the written word. Although she's an incredible writer, and I think she has a future as a writer as well. But the words married to the images in her graphic novel Pure, I think are just so incredibly powerful. So that's a massive introduction to this conversation, but an explanation of why this is so meaningful to me. And even if you're not into comics, I think that there's so much to learn about this particular art form. There's so much to learn about the processing of old beliefs, the questions of what it looks like to heal, what it looks like to look back, uh, to both tear down things that are unhealthy and yet also have empathy towards a younger version of yourself. And Stephanie just embodies that so effectively. So here's my conversation with Stephanie Stalvey. Stephanie, it's so great to have you.
Josh, I'm always happy whenever I get to talk to you, especially the podcast. It's just an extra bonus.
It's so funny to be seeing you virtually in person like this when I see your the cartoon version of Stephanie so often on your Instagram.
Oh, yeah.
It's like talking to Wonder Woman in person or something, you know? Did you grow up reading comics?
Yeah, I grew up reading all kinds of comics. Like the superhero comics, but also a lot of the indie comics. I think anybody who reads them can tell I like Craig Thompson and all that kind of those guys from the 90s. Love and Rocket, Alison Bechdel. Those are all my favorites.
Very cool. I mean, we both grew up in Christian families. I'm just wondering, was there any pushback from your parents or from your church community about being into comics?
I feel like my parents were pretty cool as far as like the hyper controlling what kind of media we consumed. They weren't really that style. They were pretty permissive about that, and I'm very grateful. But there was definitely a few conversations, I think, because I would learn to like draw by copying like the superhero comics. And a couple of times I remember being told like this is too like risque. Just the way that all of the women in the superhero comics were drawn. And I was like a little too much anatomy.
That's so funny. It's true. I mean, that is a common theme in superhero comics. Yeah. The way the female heroes are drawn are it's always their clothes are always sprayed on for sure.
Well, I mean, they all are, right? It's a good way to learn like the muscles and everything. It's a light drawing class.
In your bio, you introduce yourself as a painter, writer, and comic book artist. I'm just curious, was it difficult to decide the order to put those three things in?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe I should switch the order now.
I mean, do you think of yourself first as a painter?
I think for a long time in my life, that felt more official or important. So I grew up, like you said, drawing comic books and making comic books for my own pleasure, like from the time I was little, really liking that. But then by the time I was going to college, I was like, I'm going to be a serious bohemian artist. I'm going to be respectable. So I got my degree in like oil painting, right? So I like kind of leaned into realism and all that kind of stuff. And it was fine. But at a certain point, I was like, this is what I like to do. Like, this is what I love to do is draw cartoons. And so maybe I should switch the order in the bio.
So it was almost like coming back around to say, actually, I love this. It's not a lesser form. It's actually maybe my first love when it comes to creative expression.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I do still like paint them all traditionally. So that is one thing that I think is a little bit unique in it, is that there's a lot of digital comics out there. And I think that that's great. But I really like to connect just like physically to the material. I like to be able to touch it. I like to be able to hold it in my hands. I'm very like, tactile. It's part of the process for me.
Right. So everything about your comics, except for like the words, That's all done by hand, and then you digitize it and add the words? Is that how it
Yeah.
works?
Yeah. So for most of it, it's just like penciled and micron pens, watercolor for the black and white stuff. And then I'll like change it so it's black and white, put all the borders and everything on the computer. And then the color parts are gouache and watercolor paint. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we're going to talk about all this, but I'm wondering if you could just start by explaining the project that you're primarily working on right now, the graphic novel that you're working on now. How would you explain that to someone?
Yeah. Well, it's called Pure, and it's a memoir that I think I started making these kind of church kids comics sometime in 2020. And there was something in me that just needed to process and revisit a lot of the formative messages that I grew up with. In some other way than just like sitting there and thinking about it.
Right.
And so, there was just this part of me that was just speaking to me, and I wanted to let her speak. So I started drawing and writing, and it just was a really cathartic process. So the book that I'm trying to put together now, it focuses on growing up in the evangelical purity culture and how that kind of influenced me as I was coming of age and kind of discovering my own sexuality, my relationship to my body. But also, it's about a lot of different things because I see a lot of this as connected. People are like, is it deconstruction? Is it purity culture? And I think it's kind of necessarily both, because the shame I think that we carry in our bodies and the disconnection from our bodies, I think it comes from like a really like an inner child place, like a wanting to be good, wanting to be obedient, and thinking that the way that you're obedient is that you kind of surrender your access to yourself in some way.
Right.
So I'm trying to weave those themes together, but also just like tell the story, I guess.
So you started, you can call it the Church Kid series. You started just by telling little stories from your life growing up in the church. And what was the response? You started sharing those on social media. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, I started sharing them online, and it was just so cool to see people kind of immediately connect and say, me too. Like this experience that feels so specific, or that was so specific to me, was actually shared by a lot of people. And there was so much like genuine emotion behind these little moments where, through this vehicle of online, we could find one another.
Yeah.
And I mean, when you found this stuff, I think that connected me. I don't think I'd heard about like deconstruction before 2020, like as a word or like a thing. Well, I've heard of it as a word, but I didn't hear of it as a word that we were using to kind of describe
exactly
this process of like critically examining, religion. But it was really wild. Actually, when you found my stuff and shared it, I was like, Joshua, here. And I still think that there's something so tender and beautiful and strangely serendipitous about the fact that me and you are sitting here talking about this right now. Like, that's so beautiful to me. I'm like writing a story about when I was 20 years old and had your book on my bedside table. And now we're talking. Yeah. It's cool.
Well, that is incredible. I mean, I was just before we started chatting, I was going back through the parts of your graphic novel, Pure, that you have on your website. People can actually go on and see a lot of the work that's on there, which is incredible. But there's a part in the story where you actually reference I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and I just kind of laughed to myself, like, this is such a weird universe that we live in.
I said I kissed dating
But
goodbye, sort of.
sort of, yeah, exactly. Remind me of your husband's name?
James.
James.
Yeah.
Okay. He is, he figures prominently in the book, and your relationship is unfolding in the story in a way that is just so beautiful. And I remember when I first saw some of your work on social media, it's really interesting because obviously a lot of people, as you talk about with deconstruction, a lot of people who grew up in the church and come from a place of faith have been questioning, have been rethinking different beliefs, and there's a wide range of places that people land. Some people continue to be in the church. Some people step out of the church but still have faith, or it looks a million different ways. Lots of people telling stories, though. Lots of people talking about painful experiences. There's something about the form, the medium of a graphic novel and these comics, whereas you were telling those stories, it just hits differently when through your art, you're like taking us back to the moment. That's like different than somebody just doing an Instagram video saying, I remember when I was a teenager, my youth pastor said this. It's different when you're drawing it and you're showing your teenage self responding to it. I just have found that so powerful. I guess the thing I wanted to ask you is, what has that process been like for you as you're accessing those memories, accessing those moments and drawing them? What was the kind of the emotional impact on
Oh
you?
my goodness. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you so much. And yeah, I think that's kind of the gift of narrative for me. Is I think it's unique because I really, at this point in my life, kind of want to avoid going into like a purely expository place. I don't want to be like preaching anything to anyone.
Yeah.
I just want to try to, as honestly and authentically as I can, share my experience. And you're right that it is like, in order to make that authentic and in order to have that come across to an audience, I have to get back to that place in my body and try to like encounter that girl who experienced those things. So for a lot of it, I'm actually like referencing my journals a lot, and kind of, instead of just trying to like, from the place I am now, try to like remember what was happening. I'm actually like letting her tell me. And it's crazy how it brings it back. And then when I'm drawing it, it's like, it's a slow process. It's almost like a meditation. So you're putting yourself back in that place, and it almost feels like reprocessing in a way. And I do want the project to be sort of like an embodied experience for people. Like, I want it to be like, ooh, I felt that in my tummy. I remember how that feeling in my chest. And I also want like the good parts and the excitement and the pleasure to be an embodied experience. I want it to be felt in the body because it's about something that was happening in our bodies all along.
That's so powerful. For people who maybe have heard the term purity culture, but don't immediately understand all that represents, what would your explanation be for someone? Like, there are going to be people who pick up your book in the future that haven't grown up in the evangelical church, that never read I Kissed Dating Goodbye. So how would you just explain, here's what purity culture is, and here's how it impacted me?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you say I Kissed Dating Goodbye, that book did not invent purity culture. This thing is so huge. And one thing that I always say is that purity culture isn't actually very different, I think, than mainstream patriarchal puritanical culture. It kind of presents itself as the opposite. But these kind of like formative pillars of purity culture, like a woman's virginal purity being linked to her value in some way, kind of like reinforcing monogamy and like very tight control over heteronormative. Like all of these things are old, like they're bigger even than religion. They're just like human constructs. And I think that religion gets enlisted as a tool to kind of perpetuate it and legitimize it and keep it going. But purity culture specifically is kind of like an extreme version of it. And I mean, my parents had it. My parents had it the same thing where, it's courting. It's the idea that like there's a bunch of rules around it. Like you shouldn't be alone. You shouldn't have any kind of sexual intimate connection with anybody except for your spouse, and sometimes after you're married. Like there's a bunch of different people have different takes on it, but it's kind of takes it to this extreme place, and it just becomes like really central to how people think about their own goodness and what God wants from them. And I think, how do I want to say this? They will tell you it's not about rules, and it's not about following the rules, because that's grace. Grace covers that, and they're not legalistic. They want you to know that you are obeying out of being set free, which is really ties your mind up in knots. It's not like there wasn't an explanation for all of this, but essentially, like I was one of the kids, even in high school, where I would like ask the uncomfortable questions. I'm like, well, so what do we say? Are we allowed to? How much are our crushes? How much are our fantasies allowed? How much are we able to the uncomfortable question?
Like, let's get specific here. Like,
what am I not allowed to do? And
and the response to that was always like, well, why are you asking how far you can go? That's the wrong question. You should be asking how far you can go in purity.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
I mean, I think I remember one youth leader telling me, like, if you can touch yourself without lusting, then go ahead. It's like, and so when you say things like lust, what I think that's doing is like you're disconnecting people from a really just like a part of your humanity, and you're giving them no avenue in which to have a healthy relationship with themselves and their erotic energy. It either has to not exist, or you have this kind of shameful, push it down into the shadow relationship with it.
It's true. It's true. I mean, I'm saying these things and I'm laughing about this, but anybody who knows my history, like I was a big proponent of all these ideas, not just in I Kissed Dating Goodbye, but I later wrote a book on lust called Not Even a Hint.
Oh, really?
I mean, there was like detail in that book of like how to avoid temptation. Like, don't spend too much time alone in the bathroom. It's just like really for people listening, Stephanie just about spit out her drink of water as I share that story. But that is kind of where you end up going if you're trying to take this really seriously, right? Is like, okay, how do I just at all places block off this as you put it, erotic energy and, any kind of pull towards any sort of sexual desire outside of marriage is just so wrong. And it's a slippery slope and all those things. So,
and
I just was thinking about the other word in purity culture, which is culture. And it's like this, I don't even know exactly how to explain that, but it's such an intricate web of norms and guidelines and pressures and those kinds of things. And I feel like you capture that so well in your book, in Pure, with these conversations that you have with different friends, oftentimes other women who are kind of pulling you aside as your relationship, is unfolding and you're falling for James. And it's not like, and what I love about it is it's so accurate because the pressure in purity culture, it comes in these very subtle forms. It's not just the pastor preaching something. It's not just, a book that's being pushed on you. It's these little conversations where people are like, well, this is really what God wants.
Yeah.
And whoa, be careful. And you show those so brilliantly in your book. Did you reference a lot of actual conversations that you had and
yes,
as you wrote that?
Oh, definitely. So I have to kind of like condense the narrative down. So oftentimes I'll combine multiple conversations that I've had into one.
Right.
But I try to be as faithful to real things that I heard and kind of put them on the table, and just little moments that are kind of in my brain. Once you're married, just do it. Little moments that I'm like, okay, boom, 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 boom. That was registering, this is okay. This is in there. And then just when you put it on the page, this is what you heard. And I'm careful in my work. One thing that is really important to me is that I don't want to flatten complex human kind of experiences and intentions. And I don't want to demonize anybody, because even I think in the couple of pages that you're referencing, the girls that were talking to me were genuinely trying to help me and do something loving. And I think this way kind of about all of us. You wrote I Kissed Dating Goodbye when you were how old?
20, 21.
Okay. So a fetus. Literally a baby.
Okay.
But no, I think that I have a lot of tenderness for who we were when we were trying so hard to be good and do the right thing and keep us safe. And I think that there was a lot of confusion between what is a healthy desire, which is to, have ethics and establish boundaries that feel right to you and have roots.
Right.
And, there's all these really positive things, but it becomes so much about obedience to an external authority that you have to completely surrender your autonomy and your conscience and your will over to. And so you're kind of forced, that part of you that wants to be good is forced to spend all of its energy battling the other part of you because it's convinced that it's so dangerous. Yeah, that's kind of how I think about it. And so within myself, as I'm trying to kind of, even all these years later, create inner reconciliation, inner safety. It's not about flipping so that, no, I'm demonizing the girl who was trying so hard to be good. I'm not interested in that either. Right. I'm so thankful to her, but I also want her to be able to say, it's okay. Let me introduce you to the part of me, the part of you that is erotic and embodied and
Mm,
playful and imaginative.
mm.
And you can learn that she isn't this dangerous thing that is going to ruin your life and everything that you've built. And that there can be this beautiful, um, balance of the paradox
Yeah.
that you read.
This podcast is sponsored by the creative agency Clear and Loud. Whatever your business's product, service, or idea, we believe clarity changes everything. We help you clarify your strategy, your brand messaging, and your online content so that you reach the right audience and grow your business. If you're frustrated by an ineffective website, if your message is jumbled and confusing, and you're not getting the traction you want with your marketing, let's talk. Schedule a free 30-minute consultation by visiting clearandloud.com. I think that your book is and is going to continue to be so healing for so many people because you're not trying to demonize, your past self or those people. Like, I think your way of processing that in your own life is going to, I think, just create such a safe environment for people to do the same thing as they read. What are the kinds of things that you're hearing from readers already? Like, what are some of the most meaningful responses that you're getting from people?
Oh my gosh. There it's really wild. Like there's so many people, and my heart just like floods every time that I get the comments and like the conversations that we have on Patreon too. It's just people are
Mm,
willing to, I don't know, I feel like I'm really lucky as far as like social media goes, because I know that it can get like toxic. But I've just
right,
found so far like a safe place to be vulnerable. And it's invited
right.
other people to kind of share their story as well. Um, People will say, like, this is what I heard. This is what my mom told me. This is my relationship. This
Mm,
was my first marriage. This
mm,
was my, just all these things that they want to share, all these ways that that part of them is maybe feeling seen or acknowledged. Um, and to me, that's just like really an honor. I've had a couple of people say that they like have shown it to their therapist to try to explain, because it's so hard to explain what we lived through unless you're like, yeah, watching it happen. Um,
oh, incredible. So they'll actually have their therapist read parts of your
yeah,
book.
bringing a comic book. Yeah. Or
I love that.
I do too.
That's so good.
And again, it's like, I don't know, it makes me feel like it's really humbling and it's such an honor. But I kind of have to do this thing as much as I love and I'm so appreciative of everybody. I have to do this thing where I don't think about people reading it and their reception when I'm in that actual creative space. Like I have to keep it something that I'm doing for me. And then when I
Wow.
like emerge, I can decide, okay, what am I ready to share? And I think that's the thing that keeps it art and not content creation. Do you know what I mean? Like that's
Mm,
what keeps it
yeah.
separate and sacred for me. And even like Patreon has been a cool place too for me to say like I want to do this thing that probably can't go on Instagram and then maybe not go in the book, but something in me just wants to make it, and I can share
Wow.
it with like some people
Hmm.
here on Patreon. So yeah, the
So you have a Patreon account. I subscribe to it. I'm a big Stephanie Stalvey fan, where people pay different levels of subscription so that they can get access to that community and access to things that you can't publish on Instagram and so on.
yeah. So it's very cool. But like Instagram is just weird sometimes with what it wants to flag and censor, and I want to have a space where I can be uncensored.
Right. Exactly.
And it's also just like really nice that people are so generous, that they want to donate and contribute to all the art supplies I buy every week.
That's so
Yeah.
great. I love it. Since you mentioned Instagram, what are your thoughts about the way that the rules that it has related to female bodies in particular? And do you feel sympathetic towards the job that they have to try to make decisions, or does it just seem completely random and haphazard?
Oh gosh, I don't think I know enough about it, but I think that the the censorship of bodies is just, especially in art, it just like is so frustrating for me personally.
Yeah.
I want to be careful because I think that like it is important that social media is like, you know, whatever's happening on Twitter where they're like, we're no longer going to regulate anything. And,
Sure.
that's a
Yeah.
totally separate conversation. I think,
Mhm.
it's a very purity culture kind of thing to say, to flag. I think that there was one of my pieces where it's breastfeeding and it just got flagged and taken off. And I'm like, what
So
about this?
strange.
And
Yeah.
you'll see other accounts
Yeah.
that are able to put, way more explicit stuff. So it's hard for me to understand what
Yeah.
is and isn't going to get like policed on there. I don't
Right.
know. So
Have you had any people from your past reach out to you and say, wow, I'm reading this and this is either they disagree with it or they're saying, hey, I'm sorry, I was one of those people that pushed this message on you? Any interactions like that?
I mean, not really. It's one of those things where I've had a couple of people. I've had a couple of people message me, and they've all been nice. Like, there's never been like a negative
right.
interaction. And it's one of those things where like I don't know if my parents read it or not, and I don't need to. I don't like feel the need to bring it up with them. So yeah, again, it's one of those things I think about like growing up. And
so you've not had that conversation with your parents about whether or not they're reading it?
I mean, it's weird. Like we'll be like, oh yeah, I'm working on this in the book. This was going on. It's like, okay, it's just like it's just awkward, and it to me it's fine because I'm a grown woman.
Yeah.
And
exactly. But they follow you on Instagram.
I don't know if they have an Instagram. Like, I don't know if my mom has an Instagram, but then sometimes she'll send me like reels from Instagram. So I'm like, okay.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you be tempted to block your parents if you knew they were on Instagram, or would you rather just like let them see it and then if they want to talk about it, they can?
Yeah, no, I don't think that I would. I don't think that I would block them.
Well, I mean, this brings up something that I think is really fascinating. Like the principles that you're sharing, I think are so important for writers, for, anyone that's creating any kind of message that they're putting out into the world. That idea of do it for yourself first. And if you too quickly start worrying about how people are going to respond, you're going to short circuit something. It's going to reshape it in a way that's not entirely healthy. Right. Which I think applies to so many different people. Like I'm challenged by that. I think that's really, really good. I guess this little interaction about your parents is an interesting one because, telling your story has an impact on other people. Your own process of shifting in your beliefs, I'm sure has had an impact on your parents if they're still believers.
Yeah.
So how do you navigate that kind of those personal relationships and the way in which they appreciate or don't appreciate your telling of your story?
Sure. That is such a good question. And I think that it's been like, there are times at which it's been more turbulent and, in my 20s, I think I had a lot more of a feeling that I needed to bring up how angry I was.
Yeah.
And I think now I'm just at a point where I can hold a lot more space for,
Mhm.
I don't know. It's just, it is possible for me to disagree with my parents and still have a relationship with them, or a loving relationship with them. Because I appreciate them for so much of what they did well. And I'm, you know, hoping that that whatever mistakes I'm making are not going to uproot my relationship with my own child. Um,
That's so
yeah,
good. Yeah.
yeah. And I guess maybe I'm making it sound easy. It's not that it's easy. I've had to establish boundaries, right? Because I think that one of the kind of qualities of evangelicalism, fundamentalism, is that it's boundaryless, and that
Mm.
you know, people feel the right to impose upon you and your life a set
Mm.
of very specific, very strict rules, ethics, and expectations um, that are going to govern your body and your thoughts and your minds and your decisions. And so it's almost revolutionary to say it is okay for me to think a different thing, to differentiate.
Mhm. Mhm.
There's that degree of of ownership um, of another person that I think is really inherent in fundamentalism. And so I don't feel the need to argue necessarily to try to convince them of something, because they can think and believe what they want to think. But I also have the right to, um, you know, do what I'm going to do, and to say, this is what I'm
Right.
comfortable
Yeah.
talking about. This is what I'm not. These kind of ideas, I understand that you still believe in them, but they hurt me.
Mhm.
I am triggered by anything that you might mention that is going to make me think about punitive atonement. So don't talk to me about these things. Don't talk to, and so then you're able to shift into, other places where you can still connect. You're not sacrificing the whole relationship over
Right.
that.
I'm so glad that that's your experience. I mean, it's sad when I hear about family relationships where those points of disagreement color everything, and there's the kind of, you know, um, dogmatism that says, no, unless if we don't agree here, then, it has to be cold and distant, and,
Yeah.
you know, it can't, there can't be a bridge on just the relationship of love and connection. But so I'm so glad that that's your experience. I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah.
It's interesting, the issue of boundaries. It kind of comes back to the theme of, purity culture, and the story that you tell in your book, Pure, just that there aren't those boundaries of what people are allowed to know. Like they kind of, we're all up in each other's
Yeah.
business, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like what's going on in your thought life, and what did you do and in the bedroom with your boyfriend, or,
Yeah.
all those kinds of ideas. Which again, I think you capture so well, like all these people that are pressing in and, wanting to control. As you're telling this story, a couple questions about just the uniqueness of you putting it online, so much of it online. Is there a point where you're going to stop doing that, so that there's sort of the whole thing isn't free for the world to have, and there's
Yeah.
motivation to actually buy the book? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, no, definitely. It's going to be probably half new content. And
Oh,
that's not
amazing.
just going
Okay.
to be at the end, which I am going to keep the end off of Instagram. A lot of it's going to keep going on Patreon. So my publisher has said it's okay. Keep publishing to Patreon. So if you want to keep getting
Great.
updates of the story as I'm working on the book, you can join us there.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's going to be stuff at the beginning of the story too. Kind of the beginning that I started posting on Instagram is not going to be the beginning of the book, if that makes sense.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Oh, that makes
Yeah.
sense. Okay. Awesome. Yeah.
I'm working back and forth in both directions. But that's so funny. I did make a joke that like somebody said something like, oh, it's so they feel entitled to like everything and it's none of their business. I'm like, this is probably why I'm oversharing my entire life.
Well, it's such a powerful thing to share, you know, your story in your way,
Yeah. Oh,
right?
yeah.
Versus this like people pressing in for information and then, you know, this sense of guilt and, you know, oh my goodness, I'm such a terrible person because this happened and let me confess all of my sins. It's very different to own the story in the way that you're owning your story. How do you map out telling the story? Like, you know, I've worked on books that are more you know, nonfiction types of books that are teaching a particular idea or that kind of thing. And maybe there's a narrative in there, but I understand the idea of outlining something like that. How do you outline and plan a graphic novel? Like what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, right now it's a bunch of thumbnails. So it's just like a very quick, super, super quick, like sketch, like almost stick figure things like this. The bottom panel is going to be this big. The top three are going to be this
Oh,
big
okay.
with like, you know, some dialogue, but I'm actually not always like, I'm not always patient enough to do all of the thumbnails. And I'm like, I'm going to like budget 5 to 7 pages for the walk. And then I know the general vibe,
Okay.
the general flow of what I want to happen.
Yeah.
And I have to sit down with my sketchbook and just put on music and have nothing else going on. And then I draw it all out like in that moment in pencil and I'll write on the page, like
Interesting.
what's being said. Cause I like to catch it all like at the same time. And then I can go
Yeah.
into the slower process where I'm like inking it and watercolor and all that stuff.
So with something like The Walk, you know, a certain section where a conversation is happening between you and James, like where is that in your kind of full story outline? Is that like that title there or somewhere, or you know what I mean?
Oh
Like
yeah,
I'm just trying
yeah.
to visually understand what it looks like. Do you have like a written bullet point list of all the different
Yeah,
scenes?
I've got it like on my what is this called? My iPad. And so it's like little you know, the little pages where I'll take the photograph of the original painting, but then I'll put it into this program. So it's like a million little I realize that this is a
Oh,
podcast and
interesting.
nobody else can
Yeah,
see it.
yeah.
But there's a little like thumbnail, like a
Okay,
gallery.
very good.
Yeah.
Okay, right. And so you can have some of those that are very rough and unfinished, but you're able to see the flow of the story there.
Exactly. Like this will be a break where I'm going to insert this whole other scene, you know,
Yeah,
between this page and this page. And yeah.
which I love. Like you flash back, you know, you'll flash back 4 years to when you were like in high school or
Yeah.
whatever, and then kind of explains the ideas that
Yeah.
shaped
This
you.
is
That's
why
so
I'm
cool.
breaking out in hives.
Yeah. Well, that is when you talk about embodiment, like I was just looking at the scene where you and James are like starting to make out, and then you visually are showing how it's almost like you look like you're dizzy. Like there's this physical reaction where you start to feel guilty, like, oh my gosh, we're going too far, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
When you talk about embodiment, we just unpack a little bit more of what you mean and what you hope will happen as people are reading this?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think I said before, like, this is something that was happening in our bodies, and I could not enjoy kissing the boy that I liked,
Mm,
because there was this strange kind of connection in my brain being made between like when I would feel pleasure and when I would feel excitement and arousal, and just then
mm,
this huge kind of like wave of guilt and terror. And
mm,
it showed up, you know, physically like nausea, and I would break out in hives. And there was a time when I was like 20 years old. And then my hair started falling out like in big
Oh
clumps.
my gosh.
Because I was just wrecked by guilt and shame. And it wasn't because I was doing anything wrong.
Yeah.
It was guilt and shame over normal parts of my humanity. That I just felt like this was so bad, and that I was disappointing God for this, indulging my flesh in any way, right? So for the embodiment, I want to kind of first of all, I want to show that that's kind of what was happening. So I'm trying to like find the visual language to do that. But I also want, I don't know, there's a way in which I want to give that girl back, like the gift of like how sweet and sexy this should have been, like this, that you should have been able to experience this without, you know, that kind of overshadowing and that connection being made.
Yeah.
And I think that I mean, those are the specific examples that I can like trace back. But there are ways in which I'm still learning this all the time. Purity culture still like follows us. And like, I'm asking, like, what does it mean to be a woman who has been married 11 years? And I think about marriage as an entirely different thing than when I was, 21 and got married.
Right.
And what are the things that I still feel guilty about that maybe I don't need to feel guilty about, that maybe I can encounter with more curiosity than judgment? And I just think that, like, if you're able to sit there and encounter your humanity with a little bit of compassion and interest and curiosity and neutrality, instead of immediately judging and suppressing any thought or feeling that comes up inside of you, then you have a way forward, right? Such a dead end if you're just constantly saying, oh, that's bad, smash that.
Right.
Right. Yeah. But it just, the process continues, and it shows up in a lot of different ways.
Well, I cannot wait for this book to be on shelves. I can't wait to have my own copy. Hopefully it'll be a signed copy. I'll try to work that out somehow.
I think it can hook you up.
Last question, because I know you've talked about this on Instagram quite a bit, but people are often asking, what is this like for James? Because you're not the only sexy person in this story. James is there. Thousands of women are falling in love with cartoon James, for sure. What has it been like to interact with your husband and say, hey, I'm going to go draw a picture of us, kissing, and then just his kind of reaction to being this public figure?
Well, I tell him after, not before.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Yeah.
It's so funny. The James thirst cracks me up. It's so funny because he is just like totally, like, he's just a shy person and he feels no need to be in the limelight or perceived. And so people are like, well, then are you violating his like boundary? Like, poor James, and I'm like, really? No, he's not. Like, he's okay. I'm like making this incredibly, like, I don't know. I think that he could be, he's flattered by it. I think he's flattered by it.
He definitely should be. Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's like, he's proud of me. He likes the work. He supports the work. He just doesn't, he just gets embarrassed and shy, I think, sometimes, but not to the point where he's like actually uncomfortable. He's not suffering.
Right. Well, I hope everybody listening will absolutely follow you on Instagram, visit your website, which is linked to on Instagram, where they can read many of the pages that you've made available so generously. And then for those that want to go even deeper to support you, to, become a Patreon supporter and to kind of engage with the community there. I mean, I've just been so impressed with the way that you're chatting with people there, the way people are sharing their stories. It's really an amazing community. And as part of that, just can't wait to see this book go out into the world, and then future books. Like I think you have an amazing talent, and this is just one of many. So it's very healing for me to see someone like you using the medium of a graphic novel to push back against the problems in purity culture and bring healing to so many people, when many of my past efforts helped cause some of those problems. And then the fact that it's graphic novels. I grew up loving comics, and I just think it's such a powerful form of communication. And the fact that you're using that to tell this incredible story, is so awesome. So keep going, Stephanie.
Josh, you are so wonderful. Thank you so much. Like truly, I'm truly so honored and thankful for your time and your interest, and even that you read. Like it really touches me, and it means so much to me that anybody's reading and engaging with it. And man, yeah, it's, to me, that's my native language. It's the comic books. I love it. I love the combination, just of words and images.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm just really excited. I'm really thankful. I'm thankful for you. Thank you for all those nice things you said.
Thanks for listening to the Clear and Loud podcast. I'm your host, Josh Harris. Our producer is Pam Cameron, and this episode contains music by Jeremy Yaddo at Music for Podcasts. If you like what you hear, give us a boost by subscribing or leaving a review on Spotify or Apple or wherever you listen. We'd also love your feedback on today's episode. Or if you have a question you'd like addressed on a future episode or a guest you'd like us to consider, email us at hello@clearandloud.com. You can also shoot us a direct message on Instagram. Our handle is @clearandloud. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.